Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. Doctors and nurses of Reddit, what was the creepiest last words you heard from a patient right before they died? But I don't know how to get there. Grandpa in hospice. Hadn't spoken in days. Died about 2 hours later. I work in a cardiac ICU. We had a patient who had a pulmonary artery rupture, a rare, but known complication of a Swan-Ganz catheter. 1 minute he was joking around with us and the next bright red blood was spewing out of his mouth. Get home safe, little one. It wasn't what he said the same thing to me anytime I had him as a patient for the evening. It was how he said it. He gave me this look and pause like he knew. The DNRs in my experience, always know when it's time. It's creepy. I'm a nurse and was previously working at an assisted living community on the dementia/Alzheimer's unit. My very favorite patient had been declining pretty steadily, so I was checking on him very frequently. I finished my medication rounds for the evening and went to see him before I left. He died the next morning. It really messed with me. My grandfather on his deathbed said they have no eyes, still give me chills. You're not gonna believe this, talk about a cliffhanger. Can't wait for season 2 of Old Man with Heart Failure. Not a doctor, but I overheard an old lady whisper this to her old husband dying of kidney problems. You are going to beat this, you got away with murder, this is nothing. Nurse here, had a patient come into the ER with shortness of breath. He started deteriorating in the ER, and then quite rapidly on the transport up the ICU. We got him wheeled into his room, replaced the ER lines and tubes with our own, and transferred him from the transport stretcher to his ICU bed. He didn't say anything, but just before he died he pleasantly adjusted his own pillow, laid his head down, and then his eyes went blank. This man just made himself comfortable before laying down to die. I found one of my comfort measures only patients standing at the side of his bed. It surprised me because he had been mostly unresponsive during my shift. I helped him back into bed and he asked me why all these people were in his room. He suddenly became quiet again and I noticed he wasn't breathing. Looking back, he may have been talking about me and the CNA that was helping me get him back into bed, but who knows what or who he was seeing the last minutes of his life. Still creeps me out a little when I think about it. I don't care that I'm not a nurse, but this was said by my dad to the nurse, so close enough. Backstory: Dad had he'd had it since he was 18. Diagnosed at 20, married my mom at 24, had me at 29, died 15 days short of 45. 6 months before that, he was put on hospice, that way we can have the body prepared on Thursday, the viewing on Friday, and the memorial on Saturday, so more people could come. The morning we got the call that it was time, my mom, 2 sisters, and I were about 5 minutes too late. After we said our goodbyes, the nurse pulled my mom aside and asked if that day had any significance. It's not even 6 a.m. yet, so mom doesn't even know what day it is, much less if it's important. No. Nothing is coming to mind. The nurse told her that the previous day he kept asking what day it was and they'd tell him it was the 20th. He'd look irritated but accept it. It was Memorial Day weekend, and we did just as he and mom had planned. And despite many friends being out of town for the holiday, we had over 250 people show up at the memorial service, overflowing the tiny church more than it had ever been filled. I miss him. Back when I was a CNA, this one resident fell off a bike for exercise in PT and seized. They came to and became lucid and said, "I think I'm dying," but everyone in the room assured her that wasn't going to happen. She seized up and was dead within minutes. DNR patient was on comfort cares. Was on a high dose of morphine and hallucinating. She would alternate between grasping for things not there and trying to climb out of bed. She was too unsteady to walk, so my job was to sit in the room and make sure she was safe. She grabbed my arm and pulled me down towards her face and said, very angrily, "Kill me." That one effed with me for a while. Checked in on a patient before the end of my shift and she was in good spirits, had been joking with me the whole time. Her condition was tenuous, neutral, but she had been positive throughout. I came in the next morning and she had coded and died overnight. Not a nurse, not a doctor, but I'm an apprentice funeral director. We went to a nursing home on a removal, and as we were walking down the hall, one of the patients got antsy and opened the door to his room and saw us walking with the stretcher. "I'll see you next week, boys." And guess who we had to pick up the next week? Came into an early shift and was handed over a patient who'd been very anxious and had a panic attack overnight. He was anxious all morning but ob's all fine, fine, and so I just asked someone to sit with him to keep an eye on him / reassure him for me. DRS will be in 10 minutes, so I tell him I'll get them to him as soon as they come in, but ask if he'll lie on his back for me to help his breathing. He tells me he won't make it until they get here and that he won't face the other way. If I turn to face the other way I'll die. He repeated this a few times to me. He arrested literally as the DRS walked in, and he died on the side he'd been refusing to turn to. I'm convinced he knew. Not a hospital story, but according to my family, my great-grandfather was unresponsive his final few days, but suddenly sat bolt upright in the bed and then had a huge smile and raised his hands out as if greeting someone. Then he fell back and died. Not a doctor or nurse, but my grandfather was on hospice care at home, and for 2 days he told us that he had to go with the little red-haired girl. We didn't know what he was talking about. When he died, we cleaned him up and called the hospice nurse on duty, who came right over. I happened to be the one to answer the door, and there she stood, 5'2" or so, with gorgeous blue eyes and the most beautiful red hair you've ever seen. Not a doctor or a nurse, but when I visit a friend at a hospital once, this 70-year-old guy asked an attending nurse if she'd ride his popsicle one last time in case he doesn't make it. Pretty sure he was there for a broken leg. My first hospice case. She was on morphine and started mock smoking. She looked at me, took my hand and said please in the most pleading voice I've ever heard. I sat with her body until the coroner arrived. She has no friends or family. Only her lawyer showed up. I've only done one hospice case since. My dad passed away 2 months ago, and the last words he ever said to me were "I love you too." I had this patient who had a stroke. After that he recovered fine but did get pneumonia like 4 weeks into his recovery. The last words he said to me was at like 4 in the morning, "You took his girl and you will burn in hell for it." I actually took a girlfriend from a friend of mine. Somehow he knew. I actually have 3 that stick out in my mind. An 83-year-old woman that said "My mom's here. Are we going?" She died a few minutes later. Another older lady said "I think I'm going to die today." We took vitals, everything seemed fine. She was stable. She had a heart attack a couple hours later. Not her last words, but the last she ever said to me. The last one is definitely the creepiest. A nice old lady who told my CNA she wanted to wear all white. When asked why, she said "The man in black is here." She looked in the corner of the room. The CNA looked, but there was no one there. That's when I came into the room. She died later that night. But it was unexpected. That room creeped me out for a long time after that. My mom was watching over my great-grandfather in the hospital. He'd been unresponsive for a day or so, when suddenly he said, "It's about damn time you got here. I've been waiting." And then he died. I'm working on my mother's eulogy for tomorrow's wake. I'm going to go into detail for anyone that is smoking because I think it's something you should reconsider. My mom was diagnosed with terminal lung and pancreatic cancer. Mass had developed around her vocal cords and made it hard for her to speak. She smoked all of her life, and it finally caught up with her. It attacked her quick. From time she was diagnosed, to time she passed away, it was less than 2 weeks. I was fortunate to be with my mother at that time. She was due to have hospice that Monday, but she did not make it. Lung cancer kills quickly. I hope none of you have to deal with that. Consider it that next cigarette. It's just a matter of time. Well, enough preaching. Last year, my grandfather started desperately pleading for his life with his German captors from World War II. The doctor present was smart and said in German, "You are free, Herr Caricature. You are free." And then he died. My first code as a nurse was of a middle-aged mother who we think ended up having a brain bleed. I was trying to check her vitals and she was super agitated, and had been all day. She managed to bend her forepole somehow. I was trying to start a blood transfusion, but needed to get her vitals beforehand, which was impossible because she wouldn't stay still long enough for any of it to read. I had given her a sedative, for what we thought was anxiety, and I was praying it would kick in soon. "Look at me. Help me." With fear in her eyes that I will never forget. I'm pretty sure I snapped back, "I'm trying." Which I of course wish was something comforting instead. Then she leaned back, her eyes got droopy, she shut her mouth, then snapped her eyes wide open but totally glossed over. Paramedic. 17 years/0 female, car crash. "Please, please, please, don't tell my parents I was drinking." I've commented this somewhere before but it stayed with me. I'm an RN, and while I was a student I was caring for a lady who had end-stage renal failure, had a neuron was shutting down. Read her old notes, and Bill was her deceased husband. I'm a CST, certified surgical tech, in a specialized area of surgery that sees mostly people who are up there in age. This is more of a general observation than a specific story about a patient, but more than once I've been one of the last people to see someone's loved one conscious or even alive. I've also experienced seemingly lower risk patients never open their eyes again. Always tell your loved ones how you feel. You never know if you may not see them again. Not a nurse or doctor, but my beloved grandpa was in the hospital, ill with pneumonia and sepsis. I thought he would recover. He was asking to see me and my family, so I went with my parents, my husband and my 2 little boys. Grandpa couldn't talk, but he was lucid and was watching TV in his room. He scribbled something on a scrap of paper and gave it to my oldest boy, who was about 12 at the time. It said, "I love you." When we were leaving the hospital, it hit me that Grandpa was saying goodbye, and I started to bawl like a baby. Grandpa had passed before I got home. I still see him in my dreams, only he isn't the sick old man I had known since my grandma died in 1977. He is about 40, in the prime of his life. He is healthy and strong, taking long, energetic strides across the front yard of the house he shared with my grandma for 45 years, and yet, there he is, popping in to say hello. My dad fell into unconsciousness around noon, smiled, exhaled, and died. I'm a hospital chaplain. When I was a CPE intern, a greenhorn, I went to see a patient in the ICU who had 10 to 12 oranges on her table. We talked about oranges for about 20 minutes and then she said, "Something's going to happen." I went to check on her the next day and the nurse mentioned that she passed the previous night. I asked if anyone else talked with her and she said no. So, the last conversation she had was about oranges with me. It made me feel better. I was in the army in Pakistan for humanitarian support after an earthquake. There was a very serious full bus crash when a road gave was and a dozen kids were killed. The first kid that we took off the ambulance and put on the stretcher to carry into a ear triage tent said, more like screamed, "Something in utero." When we got there the doc asked the translators what he said. It was, "The spiders are eating Papa." We all just looked at each other for a second, then just proceeded with triage. Not really creepy, but you'd be surprised how quickly patients in death's door will pass when they've had a final moment with their loved ones. One of my professors in nursing school called it permission to die. No one wants to see their loved ones go, but when the inevitable is at hand, it's better to send them off with good feelings. Don't let your loved ones feel guilty for leaving you behind. Let them rest in peace. Ugh. I was a hospice nurse for many years. Super gratifying job for a nurse, surprisingly. As a regular nurse, you are rarely offered thanks. Hospice nursing is an island unto itself. Mostly peaceful, lots of times sad, often a blessing. This is sad, but also creepy, and I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it. Had a 20-year-old kid, gang member, who was dying of primary liver cancer. Super unusual, aggressive, and terminal. He was angry at the universe. His family was there to comfort him, but he literally spit in their faces. His mom would beg him to lighten up and accept Jesus into his heart. He would swing at her and tell her to F herself. The family remained beside, in hopes he would chill out at the end. His last day, hours, moments, he was angry. With his dying breath he opened his eyes, looked at her and said, "F your Jesus." Every family member was shaking and too frightened to speak, and I left the room and took 2 days off. I don't care if I never find out what he saw. My grandma died in 1989. My grandfather, Bob, died around 1965. She never remarried, never dated, but she did have a great life. When she was dying she yelled, "Bob, Bob, here I come. Oh honey, I've missed you so much." We always joked that we were glad she didn't yell, "Bob, who the hell is that?" I may have told this one before. This is how I remember it. It was years ago. I was a junior resident. I didn't know the patient all that well, but got called up to get her paperwork ready for discharge. She was an otherwise healthy 96 or so, had a palliative colon resection for cancer, something. I went to her room to do a last wound check and DC a JP drain, and she kept talking about how she was going home to Bill. Her son pointed out that she's usually mentally very sharp, but Bill was her husband who had died years ago. He reassured her, "No, Mom, Dad is gone." "We're just going back to the house," she insisted. "No, I'm going to him. He came to see me this morning and said he's taking me home." "Whatever, I guess." Sun said she was otherwise at baseline. It was the first and only weird thing she said. Vitals and labs looked good, so we progressed along the DC pathway. Not even a few minutes later the code blue got called to her room. She was don't code, so we didn't do anything. But it was like, I guess Bill really was coming for her. Her son was surprisingly okay with how this played out. This one chilled me for a while. Names changed to protect the innocent, and let's face it, it was like 10 years ago and I don't remember anyway. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.